Talk of Tomahawk missiles has caused a tremble in the Kremlin as both sides have made bloody breakthroughs in their short and long-range strikes. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. US Vice President J.D. Vance has said that America is considering giving Ukraine its Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, one of the most formidable weapons in America's conventional arsenal. And we've had a response from Vladimir Putin today saying that this would be a significant escalation. He said, "Can Tomahawks harm us? Yes, they can. It would be a completely new stage of escalation." That's what Putin has said. It's a sign that Russia is worried. These missiles have a range of up to 1,500 miles. Now, Ukraine has hit targets that far inside Russia already. The key difference would be that Tomahawks can carry a payload, an explosive payload of almost half a ton, around 450 kilograms. And what we've talked about a little bit before on this show is these strikes against the oil refineries. We're going to come back to that because they've continued. It's one thing getting to the target, and it's another thing doing significant damage when you get there. And Ukraine has developed an extraordinary, awesome array of long-range drone weapons and drone capabilities. But the explosive power of a Tomahawk, I think, would put many of those drones into the shade. We've seen them used a lot, Tomahawks, in recent conflicts. America fired 30 of them at Iran during the summer strikes against the Iranian nuclear infrastructure. They were used against Syria in 2017. The Royal Navy fired Tomahawks from HMS Triumph into Libya during the revolution that toppled Muammar Gaddafi's rule, and of course we saw them in 1998 in Sudan, and indeed I think possibly the first time in anger in the 1991 Gulf War. I'm sure you'll correct me if I've got that wrong. Now, as far as I knew, as far as I thought, Tomahawks were actually weapons that are fired from submarines and ships. Certainly that's how the Royal Navy uses them. There are, ever since the Block 1, the original Tomahawk missiles were developed, there was a version known as the Griffon. That was a ground-launched variant, and there is a system known as Typhon, which is actually a ground-launched system, a kind of containerized system, large articulated lorries with a big green box on the back that can launch 4 of those. Now, interestingly, one of the reasons these weapons haven't been deployed in Europe was to do with the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF. Under that deal, America agreed not to station intermediate range, ground-launched ballistic missiles in Europe. Both America and Russia have withdrawn from that treaty. So the discussion about this, in one sense, can be seen as an unintended consequence of the breakdown of the sort of handrails, these weapons arms control treaties which have frayed, have eroded, have collapsed under Vladimir Putin's rule, as according to America and according to many NATO allies, Russia has ignored the conditions, and that prompted America to leave. In these long-range strikes, while we're talking about long-range strikes or the possibility of them, there's also been a really interesting signal out of America that it might increase the intelligence sharing with Ukraine to facilitate these sorts of strikes. Now, we know that Ukraine has already managed a lot of these strikes, but we do know that some of the weapons that are involved rely on complicated sort of geo-terrain mapping. It's not just knowing where the refinery is. Clearly, Ukraine has proved itself very adept at knowing where the targets it wants to hit are. Part of this sort of intelligence is about plotting a route from the launch site to the target. And that doesn't just involve understanding the terrain in enormous detail, because these weapons track the terrain. It also involves understanding where things like electronic warfare and radar defenses are located in order to circumnavigate or suppress them en route. Interestingly, Dmitry Peskov, President Putin's spokesman, responded to those claims by saying that America is already doing that. We saw a little bit of this debate about intelligence sharing when Storm Shadow missiles and French Scalp air-launched bunker-busting cruise missiles, the same weapon with two different names. When they were first given to Ukraine, we talked about that reliance, or not reliance, but they perform better with that sort of American-supplied intelligence, and that was why there was a handbrake on allowing Ukraine to fire them at targets inside Russian soil. Ukraine has continued to press what appears to be its advantage with these long-range strikes. So since our last update, we've continued to see more Ukrainian hits, specifically against Russia's oil infrastructure. On October the 1st, we saw a fire at a plant in Yaroslav. That's about 450 miles inside Russian terrain. October 2nd, drones, we actually saw the footage of the drones flying in and hitting a refinery in Orsk. Now that is about 1,000 miles inside Russia and 1,000 miles away from the Yaroslav plant as well. And we've also seen interesting footage of a refinery in Samara, which appears to show sort of cage-like structures over the refinery, the suggestion being that that is a drone defense, a bit like we saw cages over vehicles, coke cages over tanks and armored vehicles, that perhaps Russia is moving to try and defend its refineries in the same way. And why? Well, according to a report in the Kyiv Post, Ukraine has now damaged 38% of Russia's oil refining capacity. We've seen Moscow forced, and we've mentioned this before, to implement export bans. We've seen imports coming in from Belarus, so fuel imports into Russia from Belarus, queues and price hikes at petrol stations, and also a number of petrol stations closing, particularly in Crimea and eastern Russia, which appears to be the most severely affected by these strikes. So far, sort of western Russia, the area around Moscow, not feeling the pain as much. But of course, it's not at all one-sided, this conflict, and in fact there have been alarming reports this week documented in detail in the Financial Times about upgrades to Russia's weapons systems that are effectively overmatching Patriot air defences, really for the first time in the conflict. So the report in the FT suggests that the ground-launched Iskander-M missile and the air-launched Kinzhal missile, which Putin claimed at the beginning of the war was unstoppable, have had software upgrades which change their trajectories in flight. So they take a sort of fairly conventional ballistic path towards their target, but at the end they divert off that trajectory and then plummet very steeply towards their targets, and that has affected Ukraine's ability to intercept them. The figures reported that Ukraine's interception rate of these ballistic missiles was 37% in August and just 6% in September. And indeed, one of those strikes which Kyiv was unable to block was against a number of drone plants in and around the capital Kyiv, one on August 28th, which caused significant damage to the European Union's headquarters in Kyiv and indeed the British Council building, which you remember I visited with Defence Secretary John Healey a few days later. In the close conflict, in the battles in the trenches and the bombed-out villages, we've seen Russia continuing to blast its way forward, and it's making its most significant gains in Dnipropetrovsk. Reports from open-source trackers suggesting that Russia now holds at least 10 hamlets or villages in Dnipropetrovsk. This is an oblast where there was no fighting until June. It was only when Russian forces really managed to blast their way forward in that battle around Pokrovsk and south of Dobropilya that they have made these gains. Also matching those advances, persistent reports that Ukraine is short of troops. It is sparse along the front line, and that's allowing Russia to probe and look for vulnerabilities and look for... In that close conflict, though, in the shorter range strikes, we've also seen Ukraine having some success with what was reported by Russia as a drone strike in Kherson, which killed the collaborator Volodymyr Leontiev, who was the mayor of Novokharkovka. Novokharkovka, the town on the left bank of the Dnipro River, adjacent to the dam that was blown up, causing massive devastation in Kherson province. Footage showed Leontiev walking into a building, which we understand was his office. The Russians describe it his combat post, and there was a massive explosion. He wasn't killed instantly, but he succumbed to his wounds. We've also seen extraordinary footage of a Ukrainian drone shooting down an Mi-28N Russian attack helicopter. The feed from that drone showing the moment that it collides into the helicopter, and then a separate drone feed actually showing that helicopter on fire as it plummets towards the ground. In a conflict where we've seen so much of that sort of footage, it's staggering. Things like that still have the power to amaze. Quick roundup of news that's happening outside Ukraine. French commandos have boarded a ship which they say is part of Russia's shadow fleet. They've arrested 2 members of the crew. They have this reports linking that vessel to suspicious drone flights over Europe. Germany cancelled 17 flights, diverted about a dozen others after suspicious drone sightings. Denmark, which we talked about last week, had to close airports because of drones. Danish intelligence have published a document about hybrid threats from Russia. And away from the drones, but nonetheless very much related to the conflict and how it's funded, Hungary has signed a series of deals to try and diversify its oil supply away from its total dependence on Russian liquid natural gas. It signed a contract with Shell and another one with the French firm Engie, the French deal will supply about 5% of Hungary's needs, the Shell deal about 2.5%. So it's not alleviating that dependence, but it is perhaps a step in the right direction. As ever, if you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time. I'm going to rattle through 3 today. Thank you very much for them. Question number 1. What will happen after Putin leaves? It's a really good question. I think a lot of us think about that a lot. It depends on a couple of things. It depends, of course, on how he leaves and when he leaves. Simply put, if Putin were to be assassinated or toppled or ousted, as we saw that sort of possibility earlier in the conflict with the Wagner march on Moscow, the chances are, I think, he would be replaced by somebody even more hardline, and you'd probably see a coalescing around Vladimir Putin's aims, because the affront, the injury, the sense of injury to Russia and Russians of their leader being killed might actually lead to a sort of rallying around Putin's ambitions and someone even more hardline coming in. Were he to die of natural causes, I think that'd be potentially very different. It would open the door to a successor taking a departure away from his policies. Perhaps the best scenario for Ukraine and for Europe would be if the war were to end in such a way that Russia was stopped, defeated, Ukraine did gain its lands. I think that would be a scenario which Vladimir Putin would then be removed from power, whether or not violently or not, but the war would be over. He would marshal that process, and that defeat would be seen as his defeat, and it would allow somebody else to come in and take the country in a new direction. But I should caveat with this that I'm not an expert Kremlinologist, and if you're interested in that, plenty of people are more expert on that than me. Question number 2. Is the Russian police state worse than Britain's? It's quite a flippant question. We were talking about oppression in Russia last time round. I mean, maybe this question is a joke, but I just would say this. I have been banned from Russia because of my reporting. I've been tried in absentia because of my reporting, and Moscow has put me on an international wanted list because of my reporting, because I dare to challenge and report and expose the war crimes that Vladimir Putin's forces have committed, continued to commit. I should tell you that I am free in this country to criticise the British government, and often we do in our reporting about domestic policies and about perhaps the shortcomings or the lack of support as we report for Britain's armed forces. This country is nothing like Russia, and we shouldn't joke. Whilst we might criticise this government, we really shouldn't make light, I think, of the conditions that many Russians endure under Moscow's police state. Finally, question number 3. Is Kaliningrad a legitimate military target? Kaliningrad is a sovereign Russian exclave on the Baltic, surrounded by NATO countries. There are legitimate military targets inside Kaliningrad? Absolutely yes. The second part of the question was, why hasn't Ukraine hit it? Well, I would suggest because Kaliningrad at the moment does not appear to be a sort of strategic pillar which is underpinning or holding up the Russian war effort. Ukraine strikes against targets inside sovereign Russian soil have been very carefully targeted to try and degrade Russia's ability to prosecute the war. And that's why we've seen, and we continue to see, the strikes on oil infrastructure. Russia does not rely on imports, as far as I know, from Kaliningrad. So were that to change, were that different, you might see a different approach from Ukraine. But Ukraine is focused on its strikes inside Russia against the oil infrastructure to degrade two things: Russia's ability to fuel its forces, and more long-term, more strategic, to rob Russia of the oil revenues which the Russian economy and the war economy relies on. Thank you for watching. Got any questions, do ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time.